In the split second between life and death, when metal screams against asphalt and time seems to freeze, heroes aren't born from royal bloodlines or noble titles. They emerge from the shadows of duty, driven by an instinct so pure it defies all protocol and hierarchy. This is the story of a moment that lasted mere seconds, but revealed the true meaning of courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. It's about a man who chose to risk everything for someone he was sworn to protect, and a princess who learned that sometimes the most precious gift isn't a crown or a title, but the willingness of another human being to put your life before their own. What happened on that rain-soaked London street would forever change how we understand the bonds between protector and protected, between servant and sovereign, between one human soul and another. The morning of March 20th, 1974, began like any other in the life of Princess and the only daughter of Queen Elizabeth II. The spring air in London carried the familiar mix of exhaust fumes and blooming flowers that marked the city's awakening from winter's grip. Inside Buckingham Palace, the routine unfolded with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. Staff members moved through the corridors with practiced silence, their footsteps muffled by centuries-old carpets that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Princess stood before her bedroom window, watching the early morning joggers make their way through Hyde Park. At 23, she had already established herself as one of the most independent and spirited members of the royal family. Unlike her brothers, who seemed content to follow the predetermined paths laid out for them, and possessed a rebellious streak that both charmed and concerned the palace staff. She was known for her quick wit, her impatience with unnecessary ceremony, and her genuine desire to make a meaningful contribution to public service. The princess had always been drawn to causes that mattered to real people. While other royals attended ribbon-cutting ceremonies and formal dinners and preferred visiting hospitals, schools, and community centers where she could interact directly with the people she was meant to serve. This approach had earned her both admiration and criticism from various quarters of society. Some praised her for bringing a fresh, authentic voice to the monarchy, while others worried that her informal manner might diminish the mystique and dignity that had long surrounded the royal family. On this particular morning, and was preparing for what seemed like a routine engagement, she was scheduled to attend a charity event for Save the Children, an organization that had become particularly close to her heart. The event would involve meeting with volunteers, hearing about ongoing projects, and presenting awards to individuals who had made outstanding contributions to child welfare. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work that energized her and made the constraints of royal protocol feel worthwhile. As she dressed for the day and reflected on the strange duality of her existence. On one hand, she lived in unimaginable luxury, surrounded by servants, advisors, and security personnel whose primary job was to anticipate and fulfill her every need. On the other hand, she was constantly aware that her life was not entirely her own. Every public appearance was carefully orchestrated, every word she spoke in public was analyzed and reported, and every relationship she formed was scrutinized for its potential impact on the monarchy. The weight of these expectations had shaped Anne's personality in complex ways. She had developed a fierce independence as a defense mechanism against the suffocating nature of constant oversight. She insisted on driving her own car whenever possible, often to the dismay of her security team. She preferred casual conversation to formal speeches and had little patience for the elaborate etiquette that governed most royal interactions. These traits made her popular with the public, who saw her as refreshingly down-to-earth, but they also created ongoing tension with palace officials who worried about maintaining proper royal dignity. Detective Inspector James Beaton was one of the few people in Anne's inner circle who truly understood and respected her need for autonomy. As her personal protection officer, he had been assigned to her security detail 2 years earlier, and in that time, he had developed not just professional respect for the princess, but genuine admiration for her character. Beaton was a career police officer who had worked his way up through the ranks through dedication, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to duty. Born in Glasgow to a working-class family, Beaton had joined the police force at 19 with dreams of making a real difference in people's lives. He had spent years working beat patrols in some of London's rougher neighborhoods, where he had learned to read people quickly and accurately. His natural instincts, combined with his formal training, had earned him recognition as one of the Metropolitan Police's most promising young officers. When the opportunity arose to join the Royal Protection Unit, Beaton saw it as both an honor and a significant professional challenge. Working with Princess and had proved to be unlike anything Beaton had expected. Most of the royal family members he had observed maintained a careful distance from their security personnel, treating them as necessary but largely invisible fixtures in their daily routine. And was different. She made an effort to learn the names of her protection officers, asked about their families, and showed genuine interest in their opinions and experiences. This personal touch had initially caught Beaton off guard, but he had quickly come to appreciate working for someone who treated him as a human being rather than simply a security accessory. The relationship between and her security team was built on mutual respect and understanding. She recognized that their job was to keep her safe, and she generally cooperated with security protocols, even when they inconvenienced her. In return, her protection officers tried to accommodate her desire for as much normalcy and freedom as possible within the constraints of their responsibilities. It was a delicate balance that required constant communication and compromise from all parties involved. On this March morning, Beaton arrived at the palace early to review the security arrangements for the day's events. He had already conducted a thorough advance survey of the charity venue, coordinating with local police to ensure that all potential security concerns had been addressed. The route from the palace to the event location had been carefully planned to avoid areas of heavy traffic or construction that might create unnecessary risks or delays. As he waited for the princess to appear for their departure, Beaton reviewed his mental checklist one more time. His service weapon was clean and loaded, his radio was functioning properly, and he had received the latest intelligence briefings about any potential security threats in the area. There were no specific concerns for this particular event, which was classified as relatively low risk given its charitable nature and limited public access. Princess appeared in the palace courtyard precisely on schedule, dressed in an elegant but practical outfit suitable for her charity engagement. She greeted Beaton with her characteristic directness, asking about his family and making a brief comment about the weather. These small personal exchanges had become part of their routine, and Beaton had learned to appreciate these moments of human connection that helped humanize what could otherwise be a rather sterile professional relationship. The princess's car for the day was a dark blue Austin Princess, a vehicle chosen for its combination of comfort, reliability, and relatively low profile. Unlike some of the more ornate royal vehicles, this car was designed to allow and to travel with a degree of anonymity while still providing the security features necessary for her protection. Beaton took his usual position in the front passenger seat, while and settled into the rear of the vehicle. Their driver for the day was Alex Callender, experienced chauffeur who had been working for the royal family for over a decade. Callender was known for his steady nerves, excellent driving skills, and absolute discretion. He understood the unique challenges of driving royal family members through London traffic while maintaining both security and schedules. His familiarity with the city streets was encyclopedic, and he had an intuitive understanding of how to navigate through unexpected obstacles or route changes. As they prepared to depart the palace, none of the three people in the car could have imagined that this routine journey would become one of the most dramatic and dangerous episodes in modern royal history. The events that were about to unfold would test every aspect of their training, their courage, and their commitment to duty in ways that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. The car pulled away from Buckingham Palace and merged into the London traffic with the easy confidence of countless similar journeys. and reviewed her notes for the charity event, while Beaton maintained his constant surveillance of their surroundings. Calendar navigated the familiar streets with the practiced ease of someone who had made this type of journey hundreds of times before. The morning sun was beginning to burn through the light cloud cover that had blanketed the city earlier, promising a pleasant spring day. Traffic was moderate but moving steadily, and all the signs pointed to an uneventful journey to what everyone expected would be a successful and meaningful charity engagement. The mundane normalcy of the moment made what was about to happen all the more shocking and unexpected. As they drove through the heart of London, Princess Anne found herself thinking about the children they would be celebrating at today's event. The stories of young people overcoming difficult circumstances always inspired her, reminding her of the real purpose behind the ceremony and protocol that dominated so much of royal life. These connections to genuine human experiences were what made all the constraints and formalities of royal duty feel worthwhile. Detective Inspector Beaton maintained his professional vigilance while allowing himself to appreciate the efficiency of their security arrangements. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, which in his line of work was always a cause for quiet satisfaction. Years of experience had taught him that the best security operations were the ones where nothing unexpected happened, where careful planning and preparation created an environment so secure that it became almost boring. Neither Beaton nor Princess Anne could have known that their peaceful morning was about to be shattered in a way that would forever change their lives and create a story of courage and heroism that would be remembered for generations to come. The attack began at exactly 8:47 p.m. on the Mall, one of London's most prestigious and heavily trafficked thoroughfares. What had started as a routine evening journey was about to transform into a nightmare that would test every instinct, every piece of training, and every ounce of courage that Detective Inspector Beaton possessed. Ian Ball had been planning this moment for months. A 26-year-old man with a history of mental instability and an obsession with achieving notoriety, Ball had convinced himself that kidnapping a member of the royal family would make him famous and provide him with the platform he believed he deserved. His plan was crude but potentially effective in its simplicity. Force Princess Anne's car to stop, eliminate her protection officers, and take her hostage for what he imagined would be a dramatic negotiation with the authorities. Ball's choice of location revealed both cunning and recklessness. The Mall was a broad, tree-lined avenue that connected Trafalgar Square to Buckingham Palace, making it an almost inevitable part of any royal journey through central London. The wide roadway provided multiple lanes of traffic, which Ball believed would give him room to maneuver his vehicle to force a confrontation. At the same time, the location was highly visible and heavily used, virtually guaranteeing that any incident would quickly attract attention from both police and civilians. The would-be kidnapper had stolen a white Ford Escort earlier that day, a vehicle unremarkable enough to blend into London traffic, but powerful enough for his purposes. He had been following Princess Anne's car for several blocks, waiting for what he perceived to be the optimal moment to make his move. His plan required him to overtake the royal vehicle and then, suddenly, brake, forcing Calendar to stop or risk a collision. As Ball accelerated past the Austen Princess, Detective Inspector Beaton noticed the maneuver, but initially thought nothing of it. London traffic was notorious for aggressive driving, and it was not uncommon for vehicles to make sudden lane changes or overtaking attempts. However, Beaton's trained instincts registered something unusual about the white Ford's behavior. The driver seemed to be paying too much attention to their vehicle, and the overtaking maneuver felt deliberate rather than spontaneous. The first sign of real danger came when Ball's Ford suddenly swerved directly in front of the royal car and slammed on its brakes. Calendar reacted with the split-second timing that had made him one of the royal family's most trusted drivers, applying his own brakes and steering slightly to the left to avoid a collision. However, Ball had positioned his vehicle in such a way that Calendar had limited options for evasive action. The Austen Princess came to an abrupt stop just inches behind the Ford Escort, the sudden deceleration throwing all three occupants forward against their seatbelts. Princess and who had been reading in the back seat, looked up in confusion and concern. Beaton immediately reached for his radio to report the incident, but before he could transmit, Ball emerged from his vehicle with a pistol in his hand. The sight of an armed man approaching their car triggered every emergency protocol that Beaton had drilled countless times during his training. His first priority was to protect Princess, and his second was to neutralize the threat, and his third was to summon backup. However, the speed and proximity of Ball's approach left him with almost no time to implement any of these responses in their planned sequence. Ball moved quickly toward the rear passenger door, where Princess was sitting, his weapon raised, and his face contorted with a mixture of determination and desperation. He began shouting demands for the Princess to exit the vehicle, his words a confused mixture of political rhetoric and personal grievances that revealed the delusional nature of his thinking. The gun in his hand, however, was very real and represented an immediate and deadly threat to everyone in the car. Detective Inspector Beaton made a split-second decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of remaining in his seat and attempting to coordinate a response through his radio, he threw open his door and stepped directly into the path of the armed attacker. This decision violated every standard protocol for royal protection, which emphasized maintaining defensive positions and waiting for backup whenever possible. However, Beaton understood instinctively that the immediate nature of the threat required immediate action. As Beaton exited the vehicle, Ball turned his attention and his weapon toward the approaching police officer. The two men found themselves facing each other across a distance of perhaps 15 feet, with Ball holding the advantage of an already drawn weapon. Beaton's service pistol was still holstered, and he knew that any attempt to draw it would likely provoke Ball to fire immediately. The confrontation that followed lasted only seconds, but felt like an eternity to everyone involved. Beaton attempted to talk Ball down, using the negotiation techniques he had learned during his police training. He spoke in calm, measured tones, tried to establish rapport with the attacker, and convince him to lower his weapon. At the same time, Beaton was slowly moving closer, looking for an opportunity to close the distance and potentially disarm Ball before he could hurt anyone. Ball's response was to become more agitated and threatening. He screamed at Beaton to stay back and repeated his demands that Princess exit the vehicle. The gun in his hand waved erratically, sometimes pointing at Beaton, sometimes at the car, and sometimes at the growing crowd of civilians who had stopped to watch the unfolding drama. Each movement of the weapon represented a potential tragedy, and Beaton knew that the situation was rapidly spiraling beyond his ability to control through words alone. The Princess, still seated in the back of the car, could hear the shouting outside, but could not see exactly what was happening. Calendar had instinctively ducked down behind the steering wheel when Ball first appeared with the gun, but he was now trying to assess whether he could safely reverse the vehicle away from the immediate danger. However, traffic had begun to back up behind them, limiting his options for a quick escape. The turning point came when Ball made the fatal mistake of moving closer to the car in an attempt to reach Princess N's door. This movement brought him within Beaton's range of action, and the detective realized that this might be his only opportunity to prevent a kidnapping or worse. Without hesitation, Beaton lunged forward, attempting to tackle Ball and wrestle the gun away from him. The physical struggle that followed was brief, but intense. Ball was taller than Beaton and had the initial advantage of the weapon, but the detective's police training and superior physical conditioning quickly became apparent. The two men grappled for control of the pistol, rolling across the pavement, while horrified onlookers watched from what they hoped was a safe distance. During the struggle, Ball's finger found the trigger of his weapon. The gun fired 3 times in rapid succession, the sharp cracks of the shots echoing off the surrounding buildings and sending nearby pedestrians diving for cover. One bullet went wild and shattered the windshield of a parked car. The second embedded itself in a tree trunk. The third found its mark in Detective Inspector Beaton's shoulder, spinning him around and momentarily breaking his grip on Ball's weapon. The impact of the bullet felt like being hit by a sledgehammer, sending waves of pain and shock through Beaton's entire body. However, his police training and his sense of duty to Princess overrode his body's natural response to the trauma. Instead of falling or retreating, Beaton used his momentum from the bullet's impact to pivot back toward Ball, who was attempting to regain full control of his weapon. With his left arm now essentially useless due to the gunshot wound, Beaton used his right hand to grab Ball's wrist, preventing him from bringing the gun to bear on either the detective or the car. The struggle continued on the ground, with Beaton fighting through the pain and shock of his injury to maintain his grip on Ball's gun hand. Princess, hearing the gunshots, instinctively moved to the floor of the vehicle for protection. However, she could also see through the car's windows that her protection officer was wounded and fighting for his life against an armed attacker. The realization that Beaton was risking everything to protect her filled her with a combination of fear, admiration, and determination to help if possible. Calendar, meanwhile, was frantically working his radio, trying to summon backup, while keeping his head low enough to avoid becoming a target himself. He could see the struggle continuing outside his driver's side window, and he knew that Beaton was fighting against increasingly difficult odds as blood loss, and shock began to affect his strength and coordination. The sound of approaching sirens began to fill the air as London's emergency services responded to reports of gunfire on the mall. However, Beaton knew that help was still minutes away, and he was not certain he could maintain his hold on Ball's weapon for much longer. The gunshot wound was bleeding heavily, and he could feel his strength beginning to ebb as his body went into shock. Ball, sensing that his opportunity was slipping away, made one final, desperate attempt to break free from Beaton's grip and complete his intended kidnapping. He managed to partially break loose and began moving back toward the car, still clutching his weapon. This movement forced Beaton to make another life-or-death decision that would determine whether Princess would become the victim of one of the most audacious crimes in modern British history. The detective knew that his strength was failing and that he might not be able to stop Ball if the attacker reached Princess's door. With his last reserve of energy and determination, Beaton launched himself at Ball one more time, this time aiming not just to wrestle away the gun, but to completely incapacitate his opponent before help could arrive. The final phase of their struggle would determine not only whether Princess remained safe, but also whether Detective Inspector Beaton would survive his wounds long enough to see the resolution of the most dangerous situation of his career. The moment that would define James Beaton's legacy came when every logical calculation suggested he should retreat and wait for backup. Blood was streaming from his shoulder wound, his left arm hung useless at his side, and Ian Ball still possessed the weapon that had already proven its deadly potential. By any reasonable assessment, Beaton had already done more than could be expected of any protection officer. He had engaged an armed attacker, absorbed a potentially fatal gunshot wound, and bought precious time for help to arrive. But reason had little to do with what happened next. As Ball broke partially free from their struggle and began moving toward Princess's car door, something fundamental shifted in Detective Inspector Beaton's mindset. This was no longer about following protocol or even about his own survival. This had become a test of everything he believed about duty, courage, and the sacred trust that had been placed in him when he accepted responsibility for protecting a member of the royal family. Princess, still crouched on the floor of the vehicle, could see through the car's windows that her protection officer was wounded and fighting against overwhelming odds. The sight of Beaton's blood on the pavement and his obvious pain filled her with a complex mixture of emotions. There was fear for her own safety, certainly, but there was also profound admiration for a man who was literally risking his life to protect her, and growing anger at the individual who had created this nightmare situation. What many people never understood about Princess was that beneath her royal composure lay the heart of someone who had never backed down from challenge. She was an accomplished equestrian who had competed in the Olympics, someone who had spent years learning to control powerful animals and navigate dangerous obstacles. The idea of cowering helplessly while someone fought to protect her went against every instinct she possessed. As Ball approached her door and made a decision that would have horrified her security advisors if they had known about it in advance. Instead of remaining on the floor of the car, as every safety protocol demanded, she prepared to resist any attempt to remove her from the vehicle. If Ball managed to open her door, he would not find a passive victim waiting to be led away quietly. Beaton, meanwhile, was drawing on reserves of strength and determination that he didn't know he possessed. The gunshot wound had caused significant blood loss, and his body was beginning to show signs of shock, but his mind remained focused with crystal clarity on a single objective: stopping Ian Ball before he could reach Princess. And the detective's years of police training had taught him to assess threats quickly and respond with appropriate force, but this situation demanded something beyond standard tactical responses. Ball was clearly mentally unstable, making him unpredictable and potentially more dangerous than a rational criminal. The weapon in his hands meant that any miscalculation could result in multiple deaths, not just of Beaton and Princess, but potentially of the growing crowd of bystanders who had gathered to watch the unfolding drama. As Ball reached for the handle of Princess N's door, Beaton launched what he knew might be his final attack. With his right arm still functional and his legs still strong despite his other injuries, he threw himself at Ball with every ounce of strength he could muster. The impact sent both men sprawling across the pavement, but this time Beaton managed to land on top of his opponent, using his body weight to pin Ball to the ground. The struggle for control of the weapon resumed with renewed intensity. Ball, realizing that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing, fought with the desperation of someone who knew that failure meant the end of all his plans. Beaton, despite his injuries, fought with the determination of someone who understood that the life of the person he was sworn to protect hung in the balance. During this final grappling match, the gun fired 2 more times. One shot went harmlessly into the air, but the second grazed Beaton's leg, adding another wound to his growing list of injuries. However, these additional shots also had an unintended consequence that would prove crucial to the eventual resolution of the situation. The sound of gunfire so close to Buckingham Palace had triggered massive emergency response protocols throughout London's security apparatus. Police units from multiple divisions were converging on the mall, armed response teams were being deployed, and even military units were being alerted to the possibility of a terrorist incident. The shots that Ball had fired in his struggle with Beaton had essentially guaranteed that he would soon be facing overwhelming opposition. But in the immediate moment, it was still just 2 men fighting on the pavement beside Princess N's car, with everything depending on who could maintain their grip on a single pistol. The turning point came when Beaton, despite his weakening condition, managed to slam Ball's gun hand against the pavement hard enough to momentarily loosen his grip on the weapon. In that instant, the detective used his last reserve of strength to wrench the pistol away from his opponent and send it skittering across the asphalt, well out of Ball's reach. With the immediate threat of the gun eliminated, the dynamic of the confrontation shifted dramatically. Ball, now disarmed and faced with a determined police officer who had already proven his willingness to fight despite multiple gunshot wounds, seemed to realize for the first time that his plan had failed catastrophically. The approaching sirens, which had been growing steadily louder, suddenly seemed very close indeed. Beaton, despite his injuries and blood loss, managed to maintain control of Ball long enough for the first police units to arrive on the scene. The sight that greeted the responding officers was one they would never forget. A wounded protection officer, still bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds, holding down an attacker while positioned protectively between the threat and Princess N's vehicle. The arrest of Ian Ball was swift and efficient once backup arrived. Armed officers surrounded the scene, paramedics rushed to treat Beaton's wounds, and additional security personnel established a protective perimeter around Princess N's car. The immediate danger was over, but the full implications of what had just occurred were only beginning to be understood. As paramedics worked to stabilize Detective Inspector Beaton's condition, Princess and finally emerged from her vehicle. Her first concern was for the man who had risked everything to protect her. She insisted on speaking with Beaton before he was transported to the hospital, and their brief conversation would become one of the most poignant moments in the entire incident. Beaton, though weakened by blood loss and shock, was still conscious and alert. When Princess approached him, he attempted to stand and salute, only to be gently pushed back down by the paramedics who were treating his wounds. The princess knelt beside him on the pavement, seemingly oblivious to the blood and debris around her, and spoke words of gratitude that would stay with Beaton for the rest of his life. The conversation was brief and private, but witnesses reported that both the princess and her protection officer had tears in their eyes as they spoke, and later said that she had never felt such profound respect for another human being as she did in that moment for the man who had literally taken bullets to protect her. The scene on the mall had become surreal in the aftermath of the attack. Police cars, ambulances, and security vehicles filled the broad avenue, their flashing lights creating a kaleidoscope of red and blue against the historic buildings that lined the street. Crowds of onlookers pressed against hastily erected barriers, trying to understand what had happened and whether the royal family was safe. Media representatives began arriving within minutes of the shooting, their cameras and microphones capturing images that would be broadcast around the world within hours. The story of a royal protection officer taking multiple bullets to defend Princess and would become front-page news in virtually every country, transforming James Beaton from an anonymous police officer into an international symbol of courage and duty. As Beaton was loaded into an ambulance for transport to the hospital, Princess insisted on riding with him, a decision that caused considerable concern among her remaining security personnel. However, her determination to stay with the man who had saved her life overrode all protocol considerations. The image of the princess holding Beaton's hand in the ambulance would become one of the most iconic photographs of the entire incident. The attempted kidnapping had lasted less than 10 minutes from start to finish, but those 10 minutes had revealed character traits and depths of courage that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. Detective Inspector Beaton's decision to engage an armed attacker despite being outgunned and eventually wounded had prevented what could have been a national tragedy. But perhaps equally important was Princess Anne's response to the crisis. Her composure during the attack, her immediate concern for her wounded protector, and her insistence on accompanying him to the hospital had shown a side of royalty that the public rarely saw. Here was not just a privileged aristocrat expecting others to risk their lives for her convenience, but a human being genuinely grateful for extraordinary sacrifice made on her behalf. The heroic moment that would define both of their lives had emerged from circumstances that neither had chosen, but both had faced with courage, dignity, and an understanding of duty that transcended their formal roles. In saving Princess Anne's life, Detective Inspector Beaton had also revealed something profound about the bonds that can exist between protector and protected when both understand that service to others sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital had never received a more unusual patient than Detective Inspector James Beaton, who arrived with multiple gunshot wounds, covered in blood, and accompanied by a member of the royal family who refused to leave his side. The medical staff, trained to handle all manner of trauma cases, found themselves struggling to maintain their professional composure while treating a patient whose story was already becoming legendary. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the senior trauma surgeon on duty that evening, later described the scene as unlike anything in her 20-year medical career. Beaton was conscious, but clearly in shock, his blood pressure dropping dangerously low due to the significant blood loss from his wounds. The bullet in his shoulder had missed major arteries by millimeters, while the graze on his leg, though less serious, was bleeding heavily and showed signs of possible infection from debris picked up during his struggle with Ball. Princess Anne's insistence on remaining in the hospital created a security nightmare for the protection officers who had arrived as backup. The hospital suddenly found itself hosting not only a wounded police officer and a princess, but also a small army of security personnel senior police officials, and palace representatives who had rushed to the scene upon learning of the attack. The princess's behavior during these critical hours revealed aspects of her character that even those closest to her had never fully appreciated. Despite the trauma of the attack and the urging of palace officials to return to the safety of Buckingham Palace and remained at the hospital throughout Beaton's surgery, she insisted on speaking personally with Dr. Mitchell about his condition and prognosis, asking detailed questions that demonstrated both her genuine concern and her surprising knowledge of medical procedures. Word of the attack had reached Queen Elizabeth II within minutes of its occurrence, and the monarch's response reflected both her personal concern for her daughter's safety and her deep appreciation for the courage shown by Detective Inspector Beaton. The Queen immediately dispatched her private physician to the hospital and authorized whatever medical care might be necessary, regardless of cost. The initial surgery to remove the bullet from Beaton's shoulder and repair the damage took nearly 4 hours. During this time, Princess Anne waited in the hospital's family lounge, an experience that was entirely new for someone accustomed to having every aspect of her environment carefully controlled and secured. She found herself sitting alongside ordinary families who were dealing with their own medical crises, and for perhaps the first time in her adult life, she experienced what it meant to wait and worry like any other person with a loved one in surgery. The other patients and families in the hospital were initially unaware of the princess's identity, as she had chosen to dress down and avoid the formal attire that would have immediately marked her as royalty. This anonymity allowed and to observe and interact with people in a way that was normally impossible, and she later said that those hours of waiting taught her more about the lives of ordinary people than years of official engagements. Dr. Mitchell emerged from surgery with cautiously optimistic news. The bullet had been successfully removed, and while Beaton had lost a significant amount of blood, no major organs or arteries had been permanently damaged. However, the doctor warned that the next 24 hours would be critical in determining whether there would be any long-term effects from the trauma. The media response to the attack was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the incident, news crews from around the world had descended on London, turning the story into an international sensation. The image of a wounded police officer fighting an armed attacker to protect Princess and captured the public imagination in a way that few royal stories ever had. Newspapers across Britain ran headlines proclaiming Beaton a hero, and editorial writers struggled to find adequate words to describe his courage. The attack had also raised serious questions about royal security protocols, leading to immediate reviews of how the royal family was protected during public engagements. Ian Ball, meanwhile, had been taken into custody and was undergoing psychiatric evaluation. The investigation into his background revealed a troubled individual with a history of mental illness and obsessive behavior. He had left behind detailed plans for the kidnapping, including ransom demands and political statements that provided insight into his delusional thinking. The fact that Ball had been able to get so close to a member of the royal family with a loaded weapon raised uncomfortable questions about the adequacy of existing security measures. The incident prompted immediate changes in how royal movements were planned and executed, with new protocols designed to prevent similar attacks in the future. Back at the hospital, Detective Inspector Beaton regained consciousness late that evening to find Princess and sitting beside his bed. Their conversation, though brief due to his weakened condition, established a bond between them that would last for the rest of their lives, and expressed her gratitude not just for his protection during the attack, but for his willingness to risk his life for someone he had known for only 2 years. Beaton, still groggy from anesthesia and pain medication, tried to minimize his actions, insisting that he had simply done his job. However, it made it clear that what he had done went far beyond any reasonable definition of duty. He had faced an armed attacker knowing that he was likely to be shot, and he had continued fighting even after being wounded. In her view, this represented the highest form of courage and selflessness. The days that followed brought a steady stream of visitors to Beaton's hospital room. Senior police officials came to check on his condition and to debrief him about the attack. palace representatives arrived with messages of gratitude from various members of the royal family. Fellow police officers stopped by to express their admiration and support. However, the most meaningful visits came from Princess and herself, who appeared at the hospital every day during Beaton's recovery. These visits were not formal or ceremonial, but genuine expressions of concern and friendship, and would sit with Beaton for hours, sometimes just talking about ordinary things, sometimes discussing the events of that terrifying day. These conversations revealed to both of them how profoundly the attack had affected their relationship and their understanding of their respective roles. For Anne, the experience had demonstrated that the people assigned to protect her were not just uniformed accessories, but human beings capable of extraordinary sacrifice on her behalf. For Beaton, the princess's response to his injuries had shown him that she truly understood and appreciated the risks that protection officers accepted as part of their duty. The media attention surrounding Beaton's recovery was intense and sometimes overwhelming. Reporters and photographers maintained a constant presence outside the hospital, hoping to capture images of the wounded hero or to obtain interviews with medical staff. The hospital administration found itself struggling to maintain normal operations while dealing with the unprecedented security and media presence. Princess Anne used her influence to help shield Beaton from some of the more intrusive media attention, but she also understood that public interest in his story was largely positive and reflected genuine admiration for his courage. She encouraged him to consider carefully any requests for interviews or public appearances, while making it clear that she would support whatever decisions he made about how to handle his newfound fame. The physical recovery process was slower and more difficult than initially anticipated. While the surgery had been successful in removing the bullet and repairing the immediate damage, Beaton faced weeks of physical therapy to regain full use of his injured shoulder. The psychological impact of the attack also required attention, as he experienced periods of anxiety and difficulty sleeping that were typical responses to violent trauma. Throughout this recovery process, the bond between Beaton and Princess Anne continued to deepen. She made it clear that she considered him family rather than just an employee, and she insisted that he take whatever time he needed to fully recover before returning to any kind of active duty. This level of personal concern from a member of the royal family was virtually unprecedented and demonstrated how profoundly the events of that March evening had affected both of them. The investigation into the attack revealed several disturbing aspects of Ball's planning and preparation. He had been stalking various members of the royal family for months, studying their movements and looking for opportunities to carry out his scheme. The fact that he had come so close to succeeding highlighted serious vulnerabilities in the existing security arrangements. These revelations led to comprehensive reviews of royal protection protocols, with new measures implemented to prevent similar incidents in the future. The changes included enhanced screening of individuals who came into contact with royal family members, improved coordination between different security agencies, and new training programs for protection officers. Detective Inspector Beaton's actions during the attack became a case study in police training programs around the world. His decision to engage an armed attacker despite being outgunned, his persistence in fighting even after being wounded, and his ultimate success in preventing a kidnapping were analyzed and discussed in law enforcement academies from London to Los Angeles. However, for those who knew him personally, Beaton's heroism was less surprising than the public reaction to it. His colleagues had always known him to be dedicated, brave, and utterly reliable. What the attack had done was provide him with circumstances that allowed these qualities to be displayed in their most dramatic and consequential form. As his physical condition improved and the immediate crisis passed, both Beaton and Princess Anne began to understand that their lives had been permanently changed by the events of that March evening. The attack had created a bond between them that transcended their formal roles and had given both of them a deeper appreciation for the meaning of courage, loyalty, and sacrifice that 3 months after the attack. Detective Inspector James Beaton stood in the ballroom of Buckingham Palace, wearing his dress uniform and trying not to favor his still healing shoulder. The occasion was a private ceremony at which Queen Elizabeth II would personally award him the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian award for gallantry. The honor was rare and precious, given only to individuals who had displayed exceptional courage in circumstances of extreme danger. Princess and stood nearby, watching as her mother prepared to recognize the man who had risked his life to protect her. The princess had been instrumental in ensuring that Beaton's actions received the recognition they deserved, personally writing to the Queen to describe the events of that terrifying evening and to recommend that Beaton be considered for the highest possible honor. The investiture ceremony was small and intimate, attended only by Beaton's family, senior police officials, and a handful of palace staff who had worked closely with the detective during his time as a royal protection officer. The Queen's words as she presented the award were brief but heartfelt, acknowledging not just Beaton's courage during the attack, but his dedication to duty throughout his service to the royal family. For Beaton, the ceremony marked the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of another. The physical wounds from the attack had healed, but the experience had changed him in ways that would affect the rest of his career and his understanding of what it meant to serve others. He had discovered reserves of courage and determination that he hadn't known he possessed, but he had also learned about the psychological costs of violence and trauma. The decision about Beaton's future role within the Royal Protection Unit had been the subject of considerable discussion among palace officials and police administrators. Some argued that his experience and proven courage made him invaluable in his current position. Others worried that the trauma of the attack might affect his judgment or reaction time in future crisis situations. Ultimately, the decision was left to Beaton himself. After extensive consultation with medical professionals, psychological counselors, and his own family, he chose to remain in royal protection work, though in a supervisory role that would allow him to train and mentor other protection officers while reducing his exposure to direct physical risk. This decision reflected Beaton's deep commitment to the work he had chosen, but it also demonstrated his understanding that his experience could benefit others who might find themselves in similar situations. Over the following years, his training programs would become legendary within law enforcement circles, combining practical tactical instruction with profound insights into the psychology of courage under extreme pressure. Princess Anne's life had also been fundamentally changed by the events of that March evening. The attack had given her a new perspective on the risks faced by the people assigned to protect her, and she became a strong advocate for improved security training and better support for protection officers and their families. More broadly, the experience had deepened Anne's appreciation for the courage and dedication of public servants in all fields. She began seeking out opportunities to meet with police officers, firefighters, paramedics, and military personnel, not in formal ceremonial settings, but in genuine conversations about their work and the challenges they faced. The relationship between Anne and Beaton evolved into something unique in the normally formal world of royal protocol. While maintaining appropriate professional boundaries, they developed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared experience, and made it clear that Beaton and his family would always be welcome at royal functions, and she took a personal interest in his career development and well-being. This relationship became a model for how members of the royal family could interact with their staff and security personnel in ways that recognized their humanity while respecting necessary protocols. Other royals began to follow Anne's example, taking more personal interest in the lives and welfare of the people who work to protect and serve them. The broader impact of the attack extended far beyond the personal lives of those directly involved. The incident had exposed serious vulnerabilities in royal security arrangements, leading to comprehensive reforms that significantly improved protection for all members of the royal family. These changes included enhanced background checking, improved communication systems, and new tactical training that emphasized rapid response to unexpected threats. The attack also had lasting effects on public perceptions of both Princess and and the institution of monarchy itself. Anne's composure during the crisis and her genuine concern for her wounded protector had shown a side of royalty that many people had never seen before. Here was not a privileged aristocrat expecting others to sacrifice for her convenience, but a human being capable of real gratitude and emotional connection. This more human face of monarchy helped to strengthen public support for the royal family during a period when the institution was facing increasing scrutiny and criticism. The image of Princess and holding Beaton's hand in the ambulance had become an iconic representation of the bonds that could exist between different levels of British society when they were united by common values of courage, duty, and mutual respect. Ian Ball, the would-be kidnapper, was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment after being found guilty of attempted murder and attempted kidnapping. The psychiatric evaluations conducted during his trial revealed the extent of his mental illness and the delusional thinking that had motivated his actions. His case became a subject of study for criminal psychologists interested in understanding the motivations behind attacks on public figures. The legal proceedings also highlighted the need for better mental health services and improved systems for identifying and treating individuals who might pose threats to public safety. Ball's ability to plan and nearly execute such a serious crime, despite his obvious mental instability, raised questions about how society deals with potentially dangerous individuals who have not yet committed violent acts. For the law enforcement community, Beaton's actions during the attack became a legendary example of heroism under fire. Police academies around the world studied the incident as a case study in courage, tactical decision-making, and the psychology of protecting others. His choice to engage an armed attacker despite being outgunned, and his persistence in fighting even after being wounded, became the gold standard for protection officer training. However, Beaton himself was always careful to emphasize that his actions were not the result of any special heroic qualities, but rather the natural outcome of proper training, clear thinking, and a deep commitment to duty. He frequently told audiences that any well-trained protection officer would have acted similarly in the same circumstances, though few who heard him speak believed that to be entirely true. The years following the attack saw Beaton rise through the ranks of the Metropolitan Police, eventually becoming one of the most respected figures in British law enforcement. His expertise in security matters was sought by police departments around the world, and he became a frequent speaker at international conferences on personal protection and crisis response. Throughout his later career, Beaton remained in contact with Princess, and their friendship became one of the most enduring relationships in either of their lives. When Beaton retired from active police service 30 years later, Princess was among the speakers at his retirement ceremony, delivering a tribute that brought many of the assembled officers to tears. In her remarks, the Princess spoke not just about the events of that March evening, but about the ongoing example that Beaton had set throughout his career. She described him as someone who had demonstrated that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of fear when duty and conscience demanded action. The legacy of that terrifying evening on the Mall extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence how Britain thought about courage, duty, and the bonds that unite people across different social classes and roles. The story of a working-class police officer who risked his life to protect a princess, and of a princess who never forgot that sacrifice, became part of the nation's collective memory of its better angels. For Detective Inspector James Beaton and Princess, and the attack had been a defining moment that revealed the best qualities in both of them. For Britain as a whole, it had been a reminder that heroism could emerge from the most ordinary circumstances, and that the bonds of duty and gratitude could transcend all barriers of class and privilege. The events of that March evening would continue to inspire police officers, protection specialists, and ordinary citizens for generations to come. In an age often marked by cynicism about public service and skepticism about the value of traditional institutions, the story of James Beaton and Princess provided a powerful reminder that courage, loyalty, and mutual respect remained the foundation stones of civilized society. Years later, when people asked Beaton about that night, he would always say that he had simply done his job. But those who knew the full story understood that on that rain-soaked street in London, he had done much more than that. He had demonstrated what it meant to serve something larger than oneself. And in doing so, he had created a legacy that would inspire others to similar acts of courage and selflessness for years to come.